I came across this little thing that I made a while ago, and you can't really see, but I wrote all over it. Oh, you can kind of see. And I was trying to outline some of the things that I was reading and discovering about the work of Dr. Daniel Siegel. And he has the book Mindsight. He has another great book called The Pocket Book Guide to Interpersonal Neurobiology. It's not much of a pocketbook, it's quite thick, but it's a very good book, and I might have mentioned it before, but I was noticing as I was coloring over some of it in darker ink as opposed to pencil that I wrote here, states become traits. And this is what I've been talking about in my thoughts about how the manic state can let us know what traits to practice to actually have those traits, as opposed to only having those traits in the manic state. And that's what I call embodying your mania. And the retrospective process is sort of harvesting your mania or hacking your mania. And he actually says it right in what I wrote down. States become traits. And the example he gave was by putting oneself in a mindful state for, say, 10 minutes a day. Eventually a person will actually have the trait of mindfulness. So the 10-minute a day practice of mindfulness leads eventually to actually just having that trait without actually having to practice anymore. And that is the same equivalent to one having a state of mania where they have all these traits in the state, but they're not actual traits that we actually have as real traits. They're temporary traits. And that's why I mention practicing the manic traits. So even I wonder, and I've never really thought of this before, if even just practicing a certain trait for 10 minutes a day alone, just creating some kind of practice around generosity, and I guess that's why people say practice gratitude. Some people have a gratitude practice, or journaling. In a way, this video making is a bit of a practice for me to just talk about stuff and make things relational. I've talked about making things relational before, and I got that from Dr. Daniel Siegel. I have several people who have influenced my thinking, and I'm especially fond of the ones that are into neurobiology. I have a different video where I talked about the work of Stephen Kotler, who I called Stephen Coulter in the video, oops, and Jamie Wheel. They talk about the flow state, and there's neurophysiology and neuroelectricity, and the brain's very interesting. So there's those two, Dr. Daniel Siegel, David Bohm, Dr. David Bohm, who's no longer with us. He pioneered the holographic theory of the brain along with Carl Primbram. I think I said that right. And I've also been influenced by Krishnamurti, J. Krishnamurti, Alan Watts, Eckhart Tolle for sure. And there's just some really great minds out there who I resonate with. But with Dr. Daniel Siegel, I don't know if it's Siegel or Segal or whatever, but I've been saying Siegel. So I think it is Dr. Daniel Siegel. Anyways, I was talking about how he talks about the relational mind, and he gives the definition of the mind as a process that regulates the flow of energy and information, and it's both relational and embodied. So embodied is the brain, and relational is our relationships. So it's like the space between people, and our mind exists in that too. And he talks about how, and I'm not really sure, it makes sense to me, but I can't really explain it right now. maybe later. You can always look up his work. That's why I talk about making one's mania relational through the traits. So the manic traits are they're quite social, a lot of them. And by making them relational, by relating in that way of the traits, as the traits, it's not only practicing that state to make it an actual trait, embodied in the brain, actually embedded in the neurophysiology and the neuroanatomy and the neuroelectricity of the brain. And that also it changes the brain by acting a different way. And that's the thing, is I feel like that extra energy in mania is actually to be shared, and it animates us in these embodied ways as a state, a temporary state, that to me is a spontaneous social behavior that is trying to basically get us to act in harmonious ways to save humanity and the planet. And that spontaneous social behavior thing is, I got that from Buckminster Fuller. And when I heard that, I just thought, oh my gosh, that's just like what mania is. It's a spontaneous social behavior. So how do we turn that spontaneous social behavior into actually embodied and relational ways of being on a daily basis? And mania is like a vision casting state. It gives us that vision, that perception that we can be that way, that we have it within us at any given moment to go into that. And it's not because it's some kind of mysterious thing. I think it's actually our natural way of being, and that the programming and the ego programming and the ways we've been educated throughout life, which I actually believe that way of educating us stops us from learning. So as children, young children, we're learning, and then all of a sudden we go to school and we're taught to memorize all this stuff. That's not learning, and that's not how we learned as children. So in my mind, all that education is it's like covering the brain with elastic bands and then like yanking on them and until they end up snapping and breaking. And when they all snap and break off, then the mind's clear and it goes back into that natural way of being and learning all the time. We don't have to go sit in a classroom to think, okay, now it's time to learn. We could be learning all the time, every moment of the day, just by looking around, just like children would. So I feel like there's a bit of a difference there with the state of mania, is that it's not about necessarily reflecting on one's limited ego thoughts. In the state of mania, that's blown entirely apart, and then we have access to an entirely different way of being and learning. And it's hyperlearning, it's creativity, it's play, it's embodying those manic traits. It's like the adult child version of ourselves. We feel free, and it's because we're free of that ego programming. And Dr. Siegel also talks about how the brain is shaped by experience and relationships. And I would imagine that's also shaped by how we experience ourselves, by how we're being. So if we're being those manic traits that we discovered we were in our manic state, and we're now trying to make them traits by practicing them or noticing that we're able to be that way, then that way it's going to change our brain. It's going to change our relationships, and it's going to change how we experience our experiences, and it's going to make it so we can actually create our experience instead of being like, this is how I am, walking around like a ping pong ball and then wondering why certain things happen. Well, we're experiencing things the way our thoughts are shaping the experience to be. And it can be a totally different way if we're practicing our manic traits, we might actually get different responses and then never actually experience things in those ways that we're wondering why did that happen, when it happened in our mind more so than anything else, the things that we take personally. So there's a lot to that. I just find his work quite congruent with my thinking process along how it relates. Oftentimes, if I see something that's kind of science-y or I read a book, I always am reading it from the perspective of, well, how does this relate to my experience of altered states of consciousness? And usually it relates a lot. It's like all there. It's just the people that are writing it aren't writing it based on an experience of altered states of consciousness or the fact that they've gone through mania, because they haven't most of the time. I don't actually read just books on, I haven't read a book in a really long time actually, but I don't read just books on mania and what it's about and what it's like. I like to read stuff on like neuroscience, and then it's all there. It's the same. You can extrapolate stuff from childhood learning to mindfulness to the way the brain operates relationally or in an embodied way to, well, how does that relate to mania and psychosis and altered states of consciousness? And, I use the word mania, but that's just a common term for it. I don't even know if that's the best description, because there's altered states of consciousness, there's extraordinary states of consciousness, there's non-ordinary states of consciousness, and who wants to just be in an ordinary state of consciousness? Nobody does. That's why people eat chips, that's why people do drugs, that's why people drink alcohol. So for people to go into this extraordinary state of consciousness, yet all of us are trying to get away from regular waking ego consciousness. We're trying to meditate it away. We're trying to, jump out of airplanes to make it go away. We do everything to make our ego go away. And then people in these altered states, they actually get there, and the coming back process is difficult. And I think there's a coming back process because we have to come back to the overall relational mind, the overall external nervous system. It's like we have our own personal nervous system, but then there's the collective nervous system, probably the relational mind. And so it's like the force of gravity, and it's like pulling us back to the collective social fabric. And that's why I feel that people that go into these states of mania, it's actually part of our sort of duty after we figure it out is to help reality level up a little bit. So people that go up and then have to come down, it's not quite a ways to come back down into the ego consciousness. And as you know, not all of us make it back to ego consciousness. Some of us don't make it back. And that's just a fact. I saw in that movie, The Not So Secret Life of the Manic Depressive, that 1 in 5 people with bipolar disorder end their life. And so far I haven't, but nothing's guaranteed. So part of my thoughts on this is actually, this is working towards and moving towards creating a framework that's a bit more gentle for people, so maybe coming back isn't so difficult. And there's things out there like peer respite centers. They have some in the United States. They used to have a Soteria house. There's different projects that have respites where people can go, where there's actually peers there, people that have gone through it themselves, and very little medication. And I went to a workshop with Dr. Michael Cornwall and Dr. David Lukoff called, I don't know, something about being with extreme states, or approaching extreme states with loving receptivity. And Dr. Michael Cornwell has a document on his website called BEST, Being with Extreme States Training. And there's some tips in there on how to orient one's energy when approaching and supporting someone that's going through this kind of process. And I feel it's more of a transformation process. And it's like transformation and then having to come back. It's almost like a scramble process. It's like getting the ego scrambled, and while it's scrambled and suspended, a person's sort of in this other state of consciousness because they're not in their ego consciousness. And then the ego sort of reforms and collects itself again. And when a person comes back to their ego and it's a bit different, and then a person's usually diagnosed with something. But I feel like once one reconnects with their ego self, one can still look back at their experience as a vision casting experience and then say, whoa, what were my manic traits? How can I start practicing them? And I think I've mentioned before, there's a paper called Therapeutic Lifestyle Design by Dr. Roger Walsh. And there's a section in there that talks about service. And he says that, well, there's a quote about how some researchers found that basically designing in service to others right away when somebody has a crisis could actually be very healing. So maybe somebody had a supposed mental health crisis and just got a diagnosis. Maybe if they help the homeless people, they will feel a bit better. And that's what the study showed, is that new services need to be designed around actually having this as one of the first steps of, they'd probably say, intervention. I don't like that word, but to me, it's in alignment with what I've experienced going through mania and psychosis, because I actually felt like I really wanted to help homeless people, especially. So if I would have come into a program that said, oh, well, you're going to help homeless people. Yeah, you had this crisis, but let's go help some homeless people. You're in this little program. I would have been like, this is what I was trying to do. So I feel actually that a person going through a crisis needs to be asked, when they're coming back to their ego consciousness, which is coming back to reconnecting with the reality, which is we are all in ego consciousnesses together, unfortunately. If reality was designed purely with the manic traits and we're all interacting that way, we would all experience reality differently, and we'd probably all be in quite a large amount of ecstasy. But it's not designed that way for now. And what I was saying was that, I don't know. So yeah, I think I was saying that a person, they connect again with their ego consciousness, and it's unfortunate, it's sad, it's a come down, it's a hangover, it's a buzzkill, it's a grieving process to be in that ego suspended state and come back. But one, I feel, can look back at the experience and say, okay, what was the cause? There are certain causes in the world that we're all sort of aware of that need to be fixed. Like, screw ego problems. In that suspended ego state, we see world's problems. We don't see personal problems. The personal has been suspended, probably so we can see the world's problems and start to maybe take interest. So a person, in my mind, needs to be asked, well, what was the cause that you really resonated with? What was the cause that tugged at your heartstrings when you weren't seeing through your ego mind and you were seeing through your heart, and you're reading the electromagnetic fields of others through their heartbeat and pattern recognition, and all the stuff that the Heart Math Institute researches. They talk about the L energy of the heart, and I don't know much about it, but it's more powerful than brainwaves. And I think when the ego mind is suspended, we actually see more with our heart, and we're reading things with our heart. There's 7 times the amount of neural pathways going from the heart to the brain than from the brain to the heart, meaning the heart is sending a lot of information to the brain. Now, whether or not the brain is listening and seeing what the heart is saying, I think that depends on how identified one is with one's ego consciousness and one's own personal problems, pleasures, and desires, and addictions, and all that. So all that extra information, it's like we get that heart connection and we don't normally listen to it. So I also think that this change in state is to allow us to see with our heart and listen to our heart. And we're going to go back to our ego consciousness, but can we still take the messages from that heart-centered state? And they might be special messages. They just might. We're told not to listen to these special messages, but I think that we're supposed to, in a way. Once we come back to our ego mind, we go back to thinking there's nothing we can do. But there still is stuff that we can do. Maybe it just doesn't feel as exhilarating as it did in the initial surge of that state. But would we rather embody the dullness of what we've been given as the story of how to interpret our experience, this one narrow band story? Or would we rather embrace our experience and harvest what we've learned from that state and from that journey and put it into play and think about the cause we connected with and actually reconnect with that cause, even if we don't quite feel it, and start to embody our manic traits, even though we find it difficult? And a lot of the difficult is in being medicated, I feel. And I'm no doctor, and I'm not advocating for anything along those lines. I do know of some things that can help, but I won't talk about that here. I also have a note here that memory retrieval modifies synaptic linkages. And I'm just thinking now that if I think back to my experiences and my first mania, if I retrieve those memories and then I paint them with the story I've been given about how it's just a mental illness and there's no meaning, and the special messages were a symptom, etc., 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 that's going to change my synaptic linkages differently. When I think of those aspects of my experience, I'm going to think of them in terms of mental illness. Whereas if I recall my memories and I think, what's the value in that? What's the meaning in that? Do I recall how I felt in that experience? Do I remember what it was like to connect with that homeless person? And even though if I was to try to connect with somebody right now, it probably wouldn't feel the same. Is this about my pleasurable feelings? Or is it about action? Was I given the pleasurable feelings associated with that action during the state of mania, so I might be motivated to actually go do that as a source of pleasure, if you want to call it that? Or was that just pure joy? Was that just me being in the state of love? Was the state of love different than my personal programmed pleasures and desires. And I feel like asking questions and exploring those experiences in that way, they're gonna rewire my synaptic connections of that memory retrieval to something else. It's going to be wiring them in terms of curiosity and wonder. And that state alone was very much a state of curiosity and wonder. So to be in curiosity and wonder about that state of curiosity and wonder might be a good thing, instead of writing it off as illness. Even if that's a helpful interpretation for professionals to have of me or you or whoever, let that be their business. I'm not a professional. I don't need to think in terms of the professional story. I don't need to take that to heart. I don't need to let that paint over all the patterns my heart saw when my ego was suspended. When the ego comes back, it sort of writes over or blocks out a lot of that experience. But I'm not going to use the stories of the professionals to further distance myself from that experience. And again, I'm not talking about thinking about that experience in terms of, I want that pleasure and ecstasy back. Because that's just more pleasure and desire. That's just turning it into a dopamine reflex. What I'm talking about is the ways we need to rise to as human beings in order to embody that and be in that naturally joyful state. To me, that experience in that state is a big clue. We're that way and we experience that much ecstasy and joy. And then we come back to our normal way of being and we think, well, why can't I have that? Well, maybe we need to kind of work towards being that way. We could wait for, the universe to intervene and give it to us again, but it's probably going to be just as disorganized and disruptive as it was the time before. When you think about it, that energy is so incredibly powerful. And we're these little fragile human beings, and we manage to sort of wander around in that state for a while. And to me, practicing the manic traits that we learned about in the manic state is about weight training. It's building up our structural and physical and sort of mental and embedded neurological pathways. If you can imagine practicing certain gestures and traits and ways of being, that's going to be wired in our muscles. That's going to be wired in our brains and our neurons. So when this energy comes in again and tries to animate us in that way, instead of having one little thin wire running on that pathway, on that circuit of that behavior, that gesture, we're going to have 100. And when that extra energy comes in, we'll be able to really utilize it. We'll have already programmed ourselves to operate in that way. And I don't think we can completely 100% mimic that, but I think we can be a lot closer to that than we are in our default ego consciousness that we've tumbled towards throughout our lives. And the people researching flow, they have some courses, and I haven't taken a course yet, but I'm thinking too, if I took those courses, I would think a lot of the clues are in the state of mania, but most people don't experience that state. and then taking a course on how to be in flow would be very beneficial. But I think for us who have gone through mania, we've already been in flow, and not flow from being in an extreme sport that we're very talented in, but just in daily life. It's like being thrown into the extreme sport of daily life, of just being a player in daily life, and we don't understand that state. So to me, it's important to look back on it afterwards and learn from it. And maybe taking a course on flow would help us understand more of how flow works, because to me, mania is like the flow of the universe. It's trying to get us to flow. It's a very flowing state. But again, society's not designed for us to just flow all day long, 24/7. And the people that take this flow course, they're probably trying to get in flow for like a few hours or a few minutes, or for their workday to get way more done in a shorter period of time. And to me, experiencing mania is a backwards effect. We've already experienced flow. We have no idea how it works. We don't know how to use it. We don't know how to design our lives around if that flow comes in again, how can we utilize it? That's another thing, is that it's one thing to practice one's traits. It's also good to say practice writing in your journal and getting your thoughts together. So maybe in mania you wrote a lot and you had a lot of stuff. If you look at it and you're like, what was I even thinking? But you might notice over time that it becomes more and more coherent. So maybe next time 50% of it is clear, whereas the first time 20% of it was clear. So if you sort of build on the clear stuff, eventually what you might want to say to people when you are in that state and you've been practicing your traits might come across more clearly than the first time, where everything just came flying out of your mouth, whether it was coherent or not. Now this next time you have a little bit more practice on what it is you're actually trying to say. And then eventually what you're saying is in line with your gestures and your traits that you've been practicing. And then the other level of it is, make sure that you have, when that state comes, if it comes again and you want to harvest it, make sure you have your notebooks. Make sure you have one designated spot in your phone where you're going to write stuff. Make sure you have your Instagram. So if you take beautiful photos and you want to share them, you can, because it's a very sharing state. So make sure you have your lines of communication open, not just with actual reality, but also with technology. And that can be iffy too, because you don't want to post like YouTube videos of you talking for hours and hours and hours about stuff that you're not sure if you know what you're talking about, right? But anyways, like you could make videos of yourself and just make them unlisted to your YouTube, and then decide if you want to post it later. And the good thing about that too is you can see what you were talking about in that state and go back to it later. So for the most part, you don't really want to share too much when you're in the state, and you want to harvest it though. So make a video of yourself talking about something you think is important. And then so yeah, that's part of like the harvesting mania lifestyle design. Just think about the ways you usually like to share. You're probably going to want to do that more. And then ways you maybe could harvest your mania and look back at it, because it might be more valuable than you think. You might be telling yourself stuff that you don't remember, because you actually don't remember a lot of what happens in that state, because the brain isn't in that mode that we're conditioned and programmed to think that learning is, which is memory, which is not. So one day, maybe I hope to have maybe a more solid thing created where it's like, well, these are ideas of ways that you might want to have this set up for when that extra energy comes, so then you can harvest it. Always keeping yourself safe, because that's one thing, is harvesting. And then you can harvest in retrospect after the fact, but you can also do a bit of harvesting when you're in the state. Not that you're looking back and reflecting on it, but it's more you're just collecting a lot of data. So you might want to choose to collect your data of what you're learning about and thinking about in a way that you're going to want to go back to it. So if you hate reading, you might not want to do a lot of writing, because then you have to read it. If you don't like looking at your face, you might not want to do video. You might want to do audio notes. And it also depends on the capacity of your device. If you have like a 32 gig something or other, you're not going to want to make videos. You're going to get frustrated. That's the thing in that state. If there's glitches in technology and things, it makes things more difficult. But that's why you can always go back to good old pen and paper. And I have a lot of notebooks full. And I don't even want to go back and read them. And I don't know if I will, but my main thing right now is more about not as much sharing what I thought of in those states, because I can't remember anyway, but it's more about sharing that maybe there's a different way to see and utilize that state after the fact when we're safe. There's a lot of work in the system of care to manage symptoms, to think about relapse prevention, and those are all valuable, but I also feel it's very important to work at moving towards being our best self. And often we had a glimpse of that in mania. So why not take some of that information and put it into play in our lives? And I feel also that by doing that, it could actually act partly as relapse prevention, because instead of sitting around scared and like just flinching at everything, I'm actually moving towards being a better version of myself that I already am, and just moving towards that. And to me, that would reduce the way, if I self-stigmatize, I'd be less apt to do that. If I'm working towards that, I can imagine people in society would stigmatize me less and probably notice less that anything was wrong. It could even perhaps mitigate some of the dullness that happens from you know what. I talked about how when I was in the hospital and I was on a lot of you know what, I changed my posture because it was actually making me feel heavy and crouched, but I changed my posture and it actually made me feel like I was strong against the you know what. I was actually strong again, like, no, you're not going to make me in that posture, which that posture makes me feel worse. If you look at Amy Cuddy's TED Talk on the power poses, just doing a certain pose and standing a certain way for a few minutes can make us feel better. Well, if we hunch over like this for 10 hours, it's going to make us feel worse. And that's how I was experiencing that in the hospital. So I consciously was like, no. And I actually, most of the time I was there, I made sure I sat like posture, like I might do if I was in a finishing school in, I don't know, the early 1900s. And it actually helped a lot. So there's small things that we can do to mitigate the effects of some of the things we have no control that are offered us. And that's the other thing, is getting a representation agreement and an advance directive. I have 2 representatives who have my advance directive. So if I get hospitalized, they come in with my advance directive and say, this is the kind of treatment she is consenting to, that she decided when she was well, and it's not unfounded. It's the type of treatment that's got her in and out of this hospital very quickly. And she does not consent to the one that made her stay 3 times as long and go through hell. And so it's beneficial to the entire system. It should make it easier for the doctor, it should make it easier for the hospital. I won't be there as long. Makes it easier on the system. They're not paying taxes to pay for my stay 3 times as long as needed. So it's a good thing to do, because I have a crisis plan in my WRAP, my Wellness Recovery Action Plan, but in the psych ward, your crisis plan, that there's a section, the treatments I consent to and the treatments I don't like. Well, that's a bunch of crap. So WRAP turns to crap in the psych ward because they don't look at it, they don't follow it. Unless it's actually put in your file somehow, they're not going to listen. So WRAP is crap in the psych ward. Otherwise, it's a pretty good program. And it's probably better to get a representation agreement, an advance directive. And I have not been back to the psych ward since to test it out to see if it works. I actually went as far as making a video advance directive. So it's me standing there with my mom and my sister, and I'm saying, I don't want this crap treatment. I didn't say that. So I spelled it out in like 2.5 minutes or 2 minutes. So that way, sometimes it's more difficult to find a piece of paper nowadays than it is to have a phone and show a video. I thought it was a lot more powerful, the video. And so now I feel safe from the system because I have my representation agreement and my advance directive. I feel pretty safe from myself because I have my PRN Seroquel, that I actually have a voice secretary app that every day alerts me, and I could press it and it would say, do you need to take a Seroquel? I never listen to it though. I just see the alert and I kind of ignore it. And I'm probably habituated to it. But I do actually now, I'm to the point where if I feel a bit off or a bit weird, I really think. I actually take note of it. I take mental note of it. And I think, like, am I disconnecting? Am I going downhill? Because the last thing I want is to go back to the psych ward. And before, I have not been quite so mindful about it and maybe let myself get to psych ward condition, and that could have been avoidable. And now I really do want to avoid it because of how I was treated last time. And I also feel safe because of my Zap strap thing that I talked about. I have a Zap strap that's just big enough to go around my wrist and the bedpost by my bed. And I have one in my bathroom because I could attach myself to the pipe under the sink. And I have one in my car because I could attach myself to my car, like steering wheel or something, which seems weird. I could be driving around attached to the steering wheel, but hopefully I wouldn't be driving around. And I also have one in my purse. So it's a good idea for me to have an idea of where I would fasten myself. And part of the plan would be to make sure I have my phone with me so I can decide if I want to calm down. I'd probably already also want to grab just 1 or 2 Seroquel. I wouldn't want to grab an entire bottle and have it beside me. And also, if I was going to fasten myself wherever I was, I would probably move stuff that I could hurt myself with. And I don't think I would, but the point is to have nothing of harm within arm's reach from being zap strapped, and just have, say, like a couple of the Seroquel and a phone. And even if I say I forgot my phone and it was across the room, I could yell, "Hey Siri," and she would probably dial somebody for me. So there's that too. I'm thinking next time if I really disconnect, that's what I might do, is just take a couple Seroquels, zap strap myself, and try and calm down. And then once I was calm, then I would call for somebody to disconnect me from the zap strap. And so that would also require making sure that my deadbolt isn't on. So there's some planning around it. And I mentioned before how once I was about to fasten myself, and after moving stuff around and then grabbing some things like a laptop and a pillow, then I realized, I don't have to. I felt safe knowing I could. And then when I was taking my sweet time and kind of gathering things, I realized, hey, I feel better. So then I never had to. But then I called my mom after that. I know for myself, at least, whenever I've had the urge to end my life, on several occasions, I've never actually wanted to. I was never thinking I want to. It felt like I had to, and I was terrified. And it felt like I was going to do it, and I didn't want to. And it was the most terrifying feeling ever. And to me, I really wonder, and I'm saddened by, I don't know how many people, if they feel it like that. I just hope that people might carry a zap strap and just, it's so terrifying, just fasten yourself and wait. Like somebody will come and help you. Just don't be near anything harmful. Just throw it away.